My daughter will be very excited that you chose that song because she thinks it's called Zoe's song. So I'll be sure to tell her. Thank you for that. Thank you for arranging that for her. Thank you all so much for welcoming me here today. Lily, I deeply respect you and the work of this organization. This room is full of people who have committed their lives to education, whether as teachers, ESPs, administrators, or other leadership roles, and it's an honor to work alongside you and to talk with you today. In his book, Teaching Toward Freedom, William Ayers wrote, "To be human is to live alone on the nerve islands of our bodies. To connect with another is to imagine with sympathy. The bridge of humanity is constructed of imagination." I read that book very early in my career, and that idea, human connection as a feat of sympathetic imagination, has stuck with me ever since. We may not be able to step inside of each other's heads as humans, but I think sometimes that our work as teachers is to try. I remember early in my career when President Obama was elected for the first time. The next morning, I went into my classroom, ready to talk with my students about his historic election and hear their reactions to it, but only after they did the do now. I stood at the front of the room with my clipboard taking attendance the same way I did every day. But I only had one student in the room. There he sat in his assigned seat right in the middle, facing me, as I checked off a little box next to his name. We looked at each other, looked at the clock, looked at each other. And then after a few minutes, he said, "Where is everybody?" "I don't know," I said gravely, "but they are late." I diligently and seriously checked his homework, as I did every day, and I marked little X's next to everyone else's name. I thought about how I'd make the rest of the lesson work with only one student. It was going to make group work a challenge. I was going to figure it out, though. And then we heard a commotion outside, and we saw some of my other students running past. And then my principal at the time burst through the door and looked at us like we were absolutely insane. "What are you doing?" he said. "Come outside." So my lone student and I followed him to the busy intersection outside, and we saw the whole rest of the school, students and staff, standing there on the corner in the middle of a spontaneous celebration. Some of them were holding up that day's paper, which had a huge picture of President Obama on the front, and others of them had grabbed mini whiteboards from the classrooms and had written "Honk for Obama" on them, and countless cars were happily obliging. The whole scene was messy and loud and completely joyous. Standing there, still holding my clipboard, which was a symbol of the rules and routines that made school feel orderly and productive to me, I realized that my stubborn insistence on sticking with the plan had been silly. My neat little plan wasn't the thing that this historic situation demanded. It wouldn't have given my students nearly enough time or space to express their joy. It was a reminder that I needed to imagine with sympathy. I needed to remember that my students and I were connected by our shared humanity. When I decided to become a teacher, I imagined that it would be a job that would nourish my deep need to be in control. I'd done my reading, right? I knew that I wasn't supposed to do the banking model and just try and fill their little heads with all of my sacred knowledge. No, I was going to be a good teacher. But I envisioned my role as one where I would activate what happened in the classroom. I didn't think that I would be an authoritarian, but I figured I'll write the lesson plans, so I'll know exactly what's going to happen, and I'll be in charge. And that felt very comforting to me. Obviously, this was a foolish miscalculation. Teaching, like parenting, can show us just how powerless we really are. The most carefully crafted lesson plan can be thrown off by a snow day or a fire drill, a fight in the hallway, a curious student's questions that lead us off on an interesting but tenuously relevant tangent. Sometimes we realize students know more or less than we anticipated, or a protocol that looked really good on paper falls to pieces when we put it on its feet. Or there are days like that one in November when Obama was elected, when what's happening outside of the school bangs on the door and demands to come in. When I got hired to teach 9th grade humanities at the school where I've worked for the past decade, I inherited a beautiful course called Justice and Injustice. I've made it my own over the years, but the bones were there. It was a course interweaving history content with literacy, focused on case studies of moments when people faced injustice and fought for justice. At that time, the final case study of the year centered on South African apartheid. So since I'm a history teacher, and I have all this power having this microphone, I'm going to take you on a little detour. We're going to talk about apartheid. I'm going to do a history lesson, but I'm going to come back around, I promise. So stay with me. So, apartheid. Apartheid-era South Africa was brutal. The white-ruled government used subjective and racist tests to categorize South Africans by race. Those arbitrary racial categories determine where South Africans could live, who they could marry, whether they were allowed to vote. South Africans who resisted these laws risked jail time, fines, or violence at the hands of the police and the military. Around the world, other countries' governments, including the United States, hesitated to sanction South Africa because they benefited from its resources. In 1976, the South African government passed a new law, which was called the Afrikaans Medium Decree. It required that students be taught in Afrikaans, which was the language spoken by white South Africans. Many black South Africans referred to Afrikaans as the language of the oppressor. So not surprisingly, students of color were outraged at this new law. Black students already attended segregated schools with overcrowded classrooms, insufficient materials, and a racist curriculum. Now they were expected to learn in a language that neither they nor their teachers spoke. They decided to take action. At 8:15 a.m. on June 16, 1976, thousands of students walked out of 5 schools in the township of Soweto after singing Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika, God Bless Africa. Students of all ages, including elementary school students, marched peacefully through the streets holding hands and carrying signs with slogans like "Down with Afrikaans." At an intersection, the students encountered the police and the army, who ordered them to turn back. When the students refused, the police officers set dogs on them, and then they opened fire. Within 36 hours of the march beginning, 29 people had died and 250 were injured. The government lost control in Soweto as protests and riots spread. News outlets around the world covered the story, publishing a now iconic photo of the first person killed by police, a 13-year-old boy named Hector Peterson. And although apartheid did not officially end until 1994, the students' protest had a dramatic impact on the way the world viewed South Africa's policies. As news of the uprising spread throughout the world, it became nearly impossible to ignore the brutality of the apartheid regime. In the months and years that followed the students' action, more and more countries exerted political and economic pressure on the South African government to end apartheid. Each year, my students and I study this history. We explore the ways in which South African students exercise their agency within an oppressive system that sought to silence them and deny their humanity. Invariably, my students draw comparisons between the South African students' activism and their own power and promise as young people. They wonder about what forms of political power they have and what could push them to stand up in the face of injustice. They debate whether they would be willing to risk their lives so that future generations could live in a more just world. They ask themselves whether adults will ever listen to their voices. A few years ago, in the wake of Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, Missouri, my principal received an anonymous email from one of our seniors. It informed him, firmly but respectfully, that students at our school would participate in a walkout the following day in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. At this point, staff at the school had a decision to make. Would we try to stop the students' protest? Would we use our authority and our power to try to control them? Or would we support them as they put into practice the principles of activism and social justice that we had taught them about since their 9th grade year? The principal sent a response to the entire school. He explained that, as a community, we supported our students' right to protest. He also explained that students who participated would be subject to disciplinary action, like having their parents called, since throughout the historical periods we had studied, those who chose to protest did so in spite of the consequences. He ended by encouraging students to stay together, to be safe, and to do what felt right. On the day of the walkout, most of the student body left the school and gathered on the lawn. One of the seniors stood up on a picnic table and went over expectations before they left to travel downtown together. As staff members, we gathered with them, we reminded them to be safe, and then we went back inside with those who chose to stay. That afternoon, the kids at school debated the merits of protest. They talked about their connections to Black Lives Matter, and they did class. The kids who walked out participated in a citywide student rally and raised their collective voice for justice. But no matter where they had chosen to spend their afternoon, our students, and students all over Boston, learned valuable lessons that day. They learned that the adults in their lives would support them at the same time that we worried for their safety. They learned that we would be consistent in our expectations, while also flexible enough to understand when our expectations needed to shift. They learned that they didn't need adults to tell them how, when, or where to organize. They learned that they were members of a community of young people with a shared vision of a more equitable society, and they learned that they had power within that society. They learned that events like the Soweto uprising are not ancient history, and they don't have to end in tragedy. People have asked me what I mean when I say that education can be a tool for social justice. And that's usually the story I tell to show them. As educators, it is our job to prove to our students that adults will listen to them. It is up to us to inspire confidence in them that they do have the power to affect change. It is our responsibility to ensure that they are equipped with the tools to insist on a more equitable world. But living up to this vision of our role as educators is not always easy. Sometimes our kids will point out ways in which systems that we have set up or in which we are complicit contribute to inequity. They will push us to engage in uncomfortable conversations. Their curiosity will force us to question our own assumptions and beliefs. During the Soweto uprising, the protesting students' families were rightfully frightened. They'd grown up under apartheid. They knew the danger in protesting. They'd seen their friends and family and political leaders imprisoned or killed for speaking out. They wanted their children to lay low and stay safe. As an adult, one of the protesters recalled, 1976 represented, in many ways, divorce between Black children and their parents. All of us in this room do this work because of a sincere and collective belief in a better future for our students, and because we know that they will be the ones to build it. We have to listen to them and support them in developing their voices and finding their power. And each time we witness our students coming into their own as change makers, we will be reminded of the value of education as a site of hope and a community where dreams can become reality. Looking back at myself as that new teacher, clutching her clipboard and wondering what to do when the plan didn't go as planned, I can see how much I've grown. I owe a huge debt to the people who've helped me develop as an educator along the way. My principal, who told me to come outside, the students of Soweto, who showed me that working for justice is a long-term project that requires patience, courage, and determination, and my own students, who helped me see that unless I deliberately and explicitly connect lessons from history to our own lives and context, I do them a disservice. As educators, let's replace our clipboards with magnifying glasses and mirrors and time machines. Let's create school communities in which our students can question and explore, where they can examine their own beliefs, where they can move from past to present to future all in one day. Let's work to ensure that education represents liberation. Let's keep our ears and our hearts open to our students' brilliance. It won't be easy. It won't be comfortable, but it's our privilege and it's our responsibility. To be human is to live alone on the nerve islands of our bodies. To connect with another is to imagine with sympathy. The bridge of humanity is constructed of imagination. I am honored to be able to construct the bridge of humanity side by side with each of you and with our students. Let's cross that bridge into a more just world of our own making. Thank you.
Sydney Chaffee, 2017 National Teacher of the Year.